guys, so this is actually our final session of the week because Friday this week is a bank holiday, so you only get 3 hours worth of lessons this week. So we've been focusing very much on themes, and as I said to you, I think the reason some of you struggle to write your sort of big ideas sentences is because themes are conceptually so much difficult. And in English, we're thinking very much in a kind of tiered approach. So if you're able to explain what happens, we call that the plot of a text. You can say what happens. That's considered a fairly basic skill that scores few marks. If you can talk about characters, who they are, what they do, then that can get you a few more marks. But to access those high marks, we have to be able to write about the themes. The plot and the characters are devices which create meaning. So if we can always think, this is the character, this is what they're like, this is what they do, but this is the meaning that they create for me as a reader, then we can get high marks. So I've really wanted us to practice that this week. And obviously your teachers would re-practice that with you when you go back to school. So start today with a quick recall task, which is trying to get this conceptual idea of themes nailed down. So there are 4 sentences. I don't think there's much need really to copy the sentences out. I think you could just write down the missing words. If you want to write them out, then obviously pause the video. But I'll read them to you and you can just write down the missing words. So in simple terms, the themes of the story are the main what? However, we also need to think about the blanks that are being communicated through these topics. We also need to understand how the themes relate to. If themes transcend time, we call them, let me quickly correct that, we call them something. So please pause the video, either copy it out and fill in the gaps or write down the 4 words that you think are missing. Great, okay, so quick self-assessment then. I wanted you to write, in simple terms, the themes of the story are the main topics, okay? So, in A Christmas Carol, family, poverty, Christmas, greed, topics, things that this book is about. However, we also need to think about the messages, okay? So, it's great to be able to say that greed is a theme of the book. But we cannot really get any marks unless we can say what the message is. So greed is the theme. The message is that, greed is a really negative human behaviour that causes an awful lot of suffering. We also need to understand how the themes relate to, something along the lines there of real world that the author lived in. So that's a bit of a longer one. So we know that poverty is a theme. The message is that poverty is harsh and awful and people should be kinder to the poor. And it reflects the real world that Dickens lived in because he lived in a world where there was extreme poverty and very little help for people who were poor. If themes transcend time, we call them universal, okay? So the theme of greed is universal. People are still greedy to this day. People still want to keep everything to themselves and ignore that another human being is suffering. A universal theme. And that's the core principles of themes. They're the topics, they're the tools, the ideas of the author are within those topics. They often relate to the real world that the author lived in, but with these great writers like Dickens and Shakespeare, they are universal because we can still understand them within our world without necessarily knowing about his world. So what I want to do today is to try to think about if you're given a passage, which you will be in your exams, and you're asked to analyse the passage, how do you pick themes out? And I think that's the difficult bit, trying to link text to theme. So we're going to start with Tiny Tim. So I've taken this little passage from the book, and this is the very first introduction of Tiny Tim. Bob has just got home with Tim, and we learn about Tim through the discussion between Mr. and Mrs. Cratchit. So we know Tiny Tim is really important to the theme of childhood. So we're going to look at this passage and we're going to consider what evidence is there in here of Dickens presenting the theme of childhood. And I'll annotate it to show you the process that I would go through. Now, what I would just say to you is to go back to show my homework and to open the PDF that I attach to the homework, because on that PDF you have this passage. So if you have a printer, you can print it off and you can add some notes to it as we go. If you don't, you can still at least look at it. So it says, Mrs. Cratchit, and how did little Tim behave? Asked Mrs. Cratchit when she had rallied Bob on his credulity, and Bob had hugged his daughter to his heart's content. As good as gold, said Bob, and better. Somehow he gets thoughtful sitting by himself so much and thinks the strangest things you ever heard. He told me, coming home, that he hoped the people saw him in the church because he was a cripple, and it might be pleasant to them to remember upon Christmas Day who made lame beggars walk and blind men see. Bob's voice was tremulous when he told them this, and trembled more when he said that Tiny Tim was growing strong and hearty. So, the first job is always to think about the passage as a whole. We don't want to think about the passage and start trying to find words or lines within it until we've kind of thought about it as a whole. And it's clear, isn't it, that Dickens creates a really idealised view of childhood here. Tiny Tim is like an angel. This poor disabled child who isn't remotely concerned about his own well-being, it seemed. He's much more interested in the well-being of others. So immediately we can establish that in the whole passage, Tim is presented in angelic terms and shown as a child who's innocent and full of goodness. So I'm going to add that as my first little note up here. So I've said something, come on box, so I've said something about the whole passage. So just shrink the font so I've got space. So in the whole section, Dickens presents Tim as angelic and innocent. Okay, which is so important to Dickens's later message, because Dickens is going to argue that that children deserve more. They don't deserve just to be ignored by society. They deserve more. So we can then, in this whole section, find some specific words in the text which we can talk more about. And straight away, when I look at this passage, I am drawn to this simile that Bob says, as good as gold. Now, this is quite a sort of commonplace simile, isn't it? Your parents have probably used it if you've been really well behaved before. But obviously, Dickens isn't just, he could have chosen anything. What he's trying to show is that Tim is precious, because gold, we know, is a precious metal. It's valuable. So we can add a quick note here, can't we? That gold is precious, valuable. So Tim is precious, even though he's poor and therefore ignored by wider society. He is special to his family. But also it has a wider sense, doesn't it, that childhood is a precious time. Okay, so we can immediately pick up on this simile and think about how not only how Dickens is presenting the character of Tim, but also how he is presenting a wider idea about the preciousness and value of childhood. And the message here as well, isn't it, to society is don't ignore the suffering of children. Because lots of people did. Lots of people would not have taken much notice of a poor man's child like Tim. So Dickens is trying to show that actually he is special and precious and shouldn't be ignored. And then this next section as well is kind of uses a lot of religious imagery, doesn't it? So it says this very selfless words of Tim. So I'll put my little text box over here so I can add some more notes. So it says, doesn't it, he hoped people saw him in church because he was a cripple and it might be pleasant to them to remember who made lame beggars walk and blind men see. So that's quite a long detail here. But basically, it's presenting Tim as being selfless, isn't it? He isn't worrying about the fact that life is tough for him. He is thinking about the benefits for other people. But also the religious language is really important because, of course, it's Jesus, isn't it? The person who made lame beggars walk and blind men see is Jesus. So it's a reminder, just add that, reminds the reader that Jesus did not turn his back on the disabled and vulnerable. And at a time when religion was important, I mean, religion is obviously still important, but at at that time, religion and going to church was much more commonplace in society. So Dickens is tapping into the beliefs of his age and the fact that people might feel a little bit of shame at their own behaviour. If they have been ignoring the suffering, don't know what happened there. If people have been ignoring the suffering of the poor and the disabled and thinking, oh, it's not my problem, that little reminder that actually that's not the principled religious way to act, that Jesus, valued all people. So it's quite an effective way of Dickens to remind people that childhood is important. So in that short passage, we can see how we can pick out two very specific details. We can think about what the whole passage shows about childhood and particularly about Tim, and then we can find some specific details. So what I'd like you to do is exactly the same for this passage. So in this second passage, we meet the other Cratchit children. We actually meet these before Tim comes in, but I think it's easy to overlook the other Cratchit children. All I'd like to do is to read through the whole passage. Again, the passage is on the PDF that's saved to the Show My Homework, so you can open it and read it on screen if it's easier than on this video. Once you've got the PDF as well, you can also potentially go onto a site. If you Google TTS Reader, you can find a website where you can paste all of this in and it will read it to you, so that you don't have to read it to yourself if you don't want to. All I'd like to do is two things. To identify what impression of the children is created in the whole section, and then to pick out any particular words or phrases that you think relate to the theme of childhood, or present Dickens's big ideas about childhood. I'm going to start a new video, a new clip, because this one's nearly out of time and I have a 15-minute limit. So I'm going to leave you to do that. Once you've done it, once you've come up with as much as you can, go on to the next video and we'll work through it together.